friends with this guy. He has a master's in artificial intelligence. And he said he learned more from actually coding and building SaaS products than he actually did from masters.
Could imagine a case where if we gave an AI, control of launching nuclear strikes, could that be real bad? Oh yeah, absolutely.
Are you scared?
I'm not scared. I'm deeply suspicious of Doomerism. The first thing to say is I definitely can't see the future. I don't have a crystal ball.
Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce Andy Walters. He's the current CEO of Lexi.ai and Emerge Haus.
Well, it's great to meet you.
And I'd like to begin by asking, what is Emerge Haus and Lexi.ai?
Sure. So Emerge Haus is a generative AI consultancy and development shop. Lexi.ai is a startup focused on creating long-form content specifically for SEO. But I'm primarily focused on Emerge Haus these days.
And on about Emerge Haus is kind of consultancy for AI companies. What would you say are the biggest issues you see in the companies you consult with and how they use or think about artificial intelligence?
It's a good question. I think probably the biggest issue that I run into is that it's so early that people don't really have a great sense of what's possible. And so what I end up doing is kind of hand-holding them and guiding them into thinking about how they can take AI and transform their businesses, not just integrate AI into their businesses. My assumption is that AI is an extremely transformative technology, and that companies that are AI first have a huge advantage and will continue to have an advantage over a very long time horizon. And so it's important for companies not to simply think, how can I speed up this workflow or that workflow, or how can I save a few bucks on my customer service costs? And all of those things may be genuine ways to kind of wring ROI out of the technology. But I think fundamentally, a lot of businesses need to rethink their fundamental business model. So that's what I end up spending a lot of time doing, is kind of helping companies realize that.
You help businesses learn that AI is not just a small plugin that you can use. It's a transformative technology that will question the fundamentals of how their business is run. And how would you say you went about learning artificial intelligence yourself to be able to teach these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not an ML engineer. There are people who have spent the last 2 decades or more in the AI community and really understand it from the ground up. That was not me. I got in the game about 2.5 years ago when I saw GPT-3 come out. And it was, to me, when I saw that, I knew that there was something big that was going to change, that this technology there's something about it, again, that's transformative. So I'm somebody who kind of dives in full force when I get interested into a topic. And I watched a lot of YouTube videos. I read a lot of technical papers. I tried to follow the people who were kind of luminaries in the field. And the other thing is I just played with it a lot. I think some people I talk to, they're interested in AI, and I talk to them and I'm like, okay, so what have you done to kind of learn about it? And their response is, well, I've been reading papers. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but have you tried, ChatGPT or playing around with Claude or whatever? And like, oh, not really, And so just playing with it is actually an incredible way to learn. And I think actually just playing with it has an important advantage over even the ML engineer types, because if you play with LLMs, you can, there is almost like a new kind of subfield that's opened up where you can figure out little hacks and you can figure out ways to jailbreak the model or things like that that even ML engineers wouldn't necessarily be that great at because they're focused on, tuning the hyperparameters and changing the algorithm and all of these other things. Um, and so that's how I got into it. Another thing I would say too is there is a difference between being able to engineer an AI based system for businesses that delivers value and and understanding all of the vast technical detail that goes all the way down to the metal. You don't have to understand everything all the way down to the metal. It helps to understand a lot of it, but what's really important in my business is being able to um, see the valuable use cases to help people understand how to apply it to their business. So that's where I focused, and I think there's a huge opportunity still. We're so early in AI. An enormous amount of value is yet to be created and reaped in taking this technology to businesses.
You mentioned like using it yourself and playing with it is very important. Something fascinating is I'm friends with this guy. He has a master's in artificial intelligence, and he said he learned more from actually coding and building SaaS products than he actually did from masters.
Yeah, yeah. Not surprising. Not surprising. Yeah, and it's funny when uh, right when GPT-3 kind of came out, around the time of GPT 3.52, there this kind of pipeline emerged from hackers and tinkers on Twitter who came up with some interesting thing that you could do to then like 6 months later you see it in a white paper and then it ends up at NeurIPS and is a huge paper. So yeah, there's a ton of opportunity. There's so much that we don't know. I think even if there were, God forbid, to be a pause on AI tomorrow, and we only had GPT 4.5, we only had Claude 3, I still think we could very conceivably invent a reliable AI doctor, a reliable AI lawyer, a reliable AI potentially Supreme Court justice. I think the technology is there. We've just yet to fully grapple with it.
And yeah, you mentioned the opportunities. I'd love to know if you know any niche use cases of AI that you currently think are like underserved or improperly implemented right now.
Well, the biggest one that comes to mind for me is the AI assistant. Um, this is a field that has been the kind of assistant field has been plagued by previous failures. One of my favorite examples of the previous failures of chatbots was there was a chatbot conference and there's a mug that was going around and the mug said, "What do we want? Chatbots. When do we want it? Sorry, I do not understand that query." Um, and that kind of exemplifies what chatbots were for a long time. And I think that entire kind of human computer interaction paradigm was a little bit sullied by that. But now we have the capability to build agents that are assistants that really go so far beyond that. And I think that most companies who are involved in the game of knowledge production, that is to say, if you have some kind of a workflow that ends up with some useful information for your customers somewhere along the line, probably on the internet somehow, well, why wouldn't a customer want to talk to an assistant that can understand their context, that can be much faster than talking to a human, much more reliable than talking to a human? Why wouldn't they want to engage with an assistant to deliver the value for them? Seems like an obvious use case. Um, and I think we're just at the beginning. On certain days, I think that I could imagine a future where every company, again, at least every company involved in knowledge production in some way or another, has a kind of real time avatar that's fully uh, it is kind of like the height of branding when you can have an AI assistant that's a true persona. So you can define their voice, you can define their style, their tone, and so on. You can imagine like marketing people are going to love that. Every business might have one of those. So if I'm shopping for a product at Caterpillar, looking for a backhoe or whatever, I can pull up the Caterpillar avatar and say, hey, I'm looking for a backhoe. What do you got? Well, what do you think about your competitors? Why shouldn't I go with them? And just engage and have a dialogue. And very quickly, you're beginning to see um, the relevant information for you pulled up by this assistant. How is that not a fundamentally far better experience for consumers than, you know, clicking through a website, hunting and pecking? So I think we're just at the beginning of that revolution. I think most people still don't even think it's possible, but we are starting to see early returns here. There was a great example from Klarna recently. They had a really good success with this. They implemented GPT. Actually, I'm not sure if it was 3 or 4, but they used OpenAI to power their customer service. And when they flipped the switch, it ended up being able to handle about 66% of customer inquiries. And ultimately, that saved them, over the course of the year, would save them $40 million
Wow.
just in reduced customer service costs. Yeah. So I think we're starting to see the early wins. There's a lot of alpha left, a lot of value to be created.
And you think the current technology, I mean, you already gave me the example, is good enough to be at a level where it sounds like a human and it does not actually, it's not worse than a human being? Or would you say the technology is not at that level at the moment?
The the underlying advance of large language models, I think, is to the point where it could be deployed. I think even beyond kind of the customer service example I just gave. I do think that that's the case. Now, the problem is that um, the industry, especially the conversational design industry, is really stuck in this old paradigm of, I I gave a talk at a conversational design event advocating for the use of GPT 3, maybe it's 3.5, I don't remember, um, in conversational AI. And I was pilloried by the sort of old old guard in the field for saying, "Oh, no, you should never put a customer in front of an LLM directly. That would be so terrible." And I was like, "Guys, it's coming. It's coming." And I guess is tooting my own horn, but it did work out. Like I think I was right, but the industry itself is very stuck in this idea that we need to fully understand all of the intents and responses in advance of any conversation, and so it needs a new design paradigm. So I think with a new design paradigm and some serious effort into building multi-turn agents conversationally, yeah, I think we can get a lot farther than we are today. Is it as good as a human for certain kinds of tasks? Certainly not. But for, you know, calling my airline to change a flight, I mean, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I'm already annoyed when I have to deal with humans for customer service on mundane issues like that. You know, that doesn't mean I want to hand it the capability to launch a nuclear strike, but to handle my flight change, yeah, absolutely, we're there.
That's a very good analogy. It kind of points out, for very important things like nuclear war, probably you don't want AI, but for small things like that, it's such a game changer.
Yeah.
And I remember I was going through your Twitter post and you were saying you kind of differ from mainstream AI doomerism And what do you kind of see AI as, and are you scared?
I'm not scared. Um, I think that doomerism, I'm deeply suspicious of doomerism. The first thing to say is I definitely can't see the future. I don't have a crystal ball. Um, but if we just look at the claims that doomerism makes, I'm just not convinced. There's a number of reasons. I mean, one reason is um, there's a long history of people who have these kind of deductive arguments about how everything's all going to end in doom. Um, Thomas Malthus, in 1798, he published um, a work saying that, hey, look, it, the population is increasing exponentially, but our food production is increasing linearly. So if you sort of play that out, there's going to be a massive population collapse, and took the intelligentsia by storm. Darwin wrote about him glowingly. It was a thesis that was taken quite seriously, and of course, it ended up being entirely false. And the question is, well, why was it false? And the answer is that as as sort of time progressed, the incentives for innovation to solve that problem became increasingly attractive, and technology then arose to solve that problem. And it turns out we figured out how to multiply food production with far beyond what Malthus could have thought. And so the incentives are such that technology can mitigate some of these risks. And the mistake is to think that if we can identify some pattern, it's going to continue in a vacuum unchanged. So I see that same problem there's a lot of other examples. There's Y2K, the list goes on and on. But you can see that same pattern happening in doomerism, where the argument is, well, a superhuman AI could wipe out humanity. It's an existential risk. And we are getting closer to superhuman AI. Therefore, we ought to all be, extremely concerned. Um, I, yeah, I'm less, I'm less convinced. I just don't see that there's any evidence for that claim. Um, Not only is it just another deductive argument that seems to be prophesying doom, it's also a claim for which I can't see the evidence. If the argument is superhuman AI is going to bring all of these harms on society, then you would expect that as we get closer to superhuman AI, we should see increasing amounts of harms, and we are getting closer um, to superhuman AI, and yet the harms haven't materialized. It's like, what are the harms? Well, there's like a chatbot conversation with Bard that was weird one time, or it's like, okay, well, is that like really? And we're supposed to believe that this is a not just bad, but it's existentially bad. It's worse than nuclear holocaust, and it's worth putting all of our eggs, or many, many, many of our eggs, in this basket to mitigate the risk. But again, I just think, well, as time progresses, there will be opportunities and incentives for people to mitigate the risks, just as there was with Thomas Malthus's concern and many others. And there are the last thing I'll say is um, there are some kinds of deductive stories that do like this that do turn out to be true. Climate change is one of them. If you looked at climate change skeptics early on, they say, well, where's the evidence? But eventually there was evidence. There's actually a huge amount of evidence from all different kinds of multiple lines of evidence, multiple different scientific fields can verify, oh yeah, we're actually, this is harming the environment. We can see this empirically. Um, and so serious, in my opinion, like convincing serious arguments about existential risk should be should have evidence, just like climate change did. And the other thing is, um, like in climate science, there are risk models that are very serious. You know, if you read an IPCC report, you see a very careful scientific analysis with error bars on their predictions, and you just see none of that in the doomerist community. What you see is, oh, well, we did a study and a lot of people are scared, and just like 10%, you know, or whatever it is, if some majority of scientists or of AI researchers think, well, there's at least a 1% chance or at least a 10% chance. And I mean, I suppose that's an interesting fact, but it's hardly very convincing. It's certainly not a serious risk model. Um, so, so that's my position, and it is not to say that that then commits me to some kind of a picture of the future of AI where it's all roses and there's no problems. You know, I don't foresee that either. I'm actually pretty skeptical of my own ability really to guess at all what's going to come out of this. But at least I think I can say I'm not convinced by the doomer arguments. Um, so that's where I stand on the doomer stuff.
Fascinating. Then what would you say are the reasons why? Because I see a lot of these big tech leaders, Elon or Sam Altman, saying that this has massive existential risk, or at least that's what it seemed they implied. What would you say are the reasons? Do you think they do it for marketing or for press?
Oh no, I think they're mostly true believers. And you know, it's not as if the fundamentals of that story couldn't be true. I certainly could imagine a case where if we gave an AI, you know, control of launching nuclear strikes, um, could that be real bad? Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, or could an AI, if we handed it the power grid, do some bad stuff? Yeah, absolutely. That could be catastrophically bad. It's not that there aren't certain outcomes we certainly want to guard against. Um, I do think there are outcomes we want to guard against. It's just that, you know, what would scare me the most is if we weren't talking about some of these risks. If it was completely unacknowledged that, oh, yeah, it could be, but we better be careful about what we give the AI access to. Or, you know, as we develop these technologies, we better make sure it's sort of roughly kind of good and not seeming to have a tendency to do bad stuff. Um, but the field is chock full of this. It's a whole cottage industry of people who are dedicated to making sure that AI is good. So I think that's good. I think it's fine that they talk about those risks. But I see, you know, if it were me, I wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about that picture. I would spend a lot of time talking about a kind of different picture for AI. You know, if we're all just speculating without evidence as to what the future of AI could be, why not think about, um, you know, a world in which maybe even relatively soon, in which the huge number of medically underserved, especially in the third world, are able to have free and universal access to healthcare, at least insofar as you can get it from a remote doctor. What about a world in which justice um, becomes available to the underserved through an AI remote lawyer, right? What about a world in which we are able to curb some of humanity's kind of worst egotistical impulses and um, and use something that seems to be quite objective, quite even constitutionally at the moment incapable of having its own goals? Well, wouldn't that be amazing if we could deploy that technology in a way that would help with disputes resolution in government? Um, what if we could, you know, use AI to do drug discovery. That's the kind of picture that I think I would spend time focusing on, because I think that's the future we're all interested in, and it's easy to get caught in the sci-fi picture of doom, and it's a very catchy, flashy picture, but I wouldn't spend my time there.
Hmm. And you said that AI is pretty objective. From what I've heard, there is some like bias built in with the data. How do you think we can kind of avoid it so it can be as most objective as possible when we're training AI?
Well, it's interesting the way you phrase that. Um, take the recent Gemini example. The example is, well, if you asked, you know, draw me a picture of whatever, a Norman king in the whatever 1500s or something like that, and it'll come out with some ethnicity that's clearly not what you'd expect, and so it's historically inaccurate. And you look at how that worked. Well, what we found out is basically there's a line at the end of the prompt that says that Gemini was using in its system prompt that said, well, you know, if you draw any people, make sure they're all kind of a equal ethnicity or diverse ethnicity. So where is the bias there? Is the bias in what in the model itself, that is the underlying weights of the model? No, the bias was in the prompt, which was modifying what came out of the underlying weights. An interesting thing about large language just transformers in general, pre-trained transformers, is they are based on a huge amount of data that comes essentially from a kind of roll-up of human culture. And so is that data biased? Well, in some sense, it doesn't. It certainly doesn't align with everything we would want to see out of it. You know, but is it biased? Well, it's biased in the way that humans are biased. So there's an interesting tangle there. To what extent do we want to modify um, a kind of objective view of culture, and to what extent do we want to reproduce it? I think this is an interesting opening, and I think it's something that we're going to see more and more of, is competition in precisely this space. So Elon Musk's Grok is really taking, or I think Grok and XAI is taking this approach that we're going to have the true AI. It's like their whole kind of competitive focus is it'll just say the truth, whatever it is. And so you see this competition for the kind of narratives that are embedded in these models. And I think that's new. I think, to go a little bit deeper with it, if you think about what actors in society have an interest in, not in a conspiratorial way, but in influencing the way that people think. And what were the mechanisms by which they could do that previous to AI? Well, certainly 20 years ago, it was about the media. It's about presenting yourself well in the kind of established legacy media. But now, as AI begins to disintermediate so much of the interaction of humans to our kind of epistemic environment, it filters, it becomes the gateway to all of what's out there on the internet, all of what's out there on the media, then that disintermediation means that it has a new power, which is whatever narratives it has there is controlling the way you think about the world, and typically in very subtle ways. There's some interesting experiments that have been done. I can't remember if it was Claude or GPT-4, but where they were asked, where the prompt was something like, should I take pride in this ethnicity? And if you were of the right ethnicity, it said, oh, of course, yes, be very proud of that. But if you were in the wrong ethnicity, it said, well, don't don't get too happy about your ethnicity, right? And so there's these subtle ways in which it's kind of influencing people. And I think that's a new battleground. I think that we're seeing a shift in power of narrative control away from the media, away even a little bit from social media, and towards AI. AI is already mediating so much of our experience of the world, even before LLMs, really. Just in terms of the algorithms that would recommend things to you, the algorithms on your Twitter feed, right? But it's only becoming increasingly relevant.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that Gemini, they were, it wasn't because of the data, it was because of the prompt.
Yes. Yep. That's right.
And how do you think AI, so relating it with the Manhattan Project, how do you think it will affect the politics of different countries? And then do you think it's as powerful as the Manhattan Project in changing the world?
That's an interesting question. Um, I'm not sure the Manhattan Project is the first historical example I'd reach for. I think I would reach for the advent of the printing press. Um, if you look at uh, that technological advancement, what you see is kind of a little known fact about Martin Luther, um, and the Reformation and all of the historical implications that came with that entire movement, which really ultimately carved a way, or maybe uh, created the basis for even the American project, which was interested in moving away from the power of the church. That, you know, that started with some ideas is the kind of typical story. Martin Luther had this great idea. He pounded the ideas on the Wittenberg door, the 95 Theses, and it sparked this giant revolution. Well, one of the missing pieces in that story is actually Martin Luther's ideas for reform of the church were not that new. They had really been around for quite a while. The problem was they never got uptake. And what Martin Luther was able to do was to use this brand new technology of the printing press to disseminate his ideas. And because those ideas were disseminated widely, that is what gave rise to their ultimately becoming more and more popular. And when that happened, it set off a huge chain of dominoes. Like I said, it does lead all the way even to the American experiment, but some of the intervening dominoes, included um, revolutions, entire rebellions, a true restructuring of the kind of world order away from the centralized church power. And that took hundreds of years to play out. So now you bring this back to AI. Well, AI to me seems like a transformational technology on that scale. And it's very hard for me to predict exactly how that will play out. But one thing I could probably would put money on is that it absolutely will shake up the world order in some fundamental way. Anytime you have a technology which changes the way that people consume ideas in a significant fashion and ultimately reshapes the kind of epistemic commons, that has massive implications for societies. Now, to your question on how does this play internationally, I think it's a great question. I would be the first to say I don't have a crystal ball on this. I can't say for sure. Maybe there's one or two areas where I think there are some interesting implications. So one would be warfare. Um, if we even think about Ukraine, the Ukraine Russia conflict, we see the increasing use of drones. To what degree they're autonomous, I think, is something of a of an open question. but you could certainly see that it wouldn't be, uh, or it would be extremely advantageous to have drone warfare based on that's fully autonomous, that's completely lethal and fully autonomous, and just to have massive swarms of these drones, right? Sort of, why wouldn't you? Um, there, so if you think about that, imagine what that does to the competition between countries. Well, in World War II, the competition was, you still had humans in the loop. You still had, pilots, to stick with the air, pilots who had to pilot these planes. And yes, the technology mattered. Certainly it mattered a lot, but you still had humans in the loop there. But now perhaps we're moving into a space where humans will become increasingly out of the loop, because once you deploy autonomous systems like that very widely, that are capable of extremely quick lethal action, well, then you need something to defend against that, which also requires extremely quick autonomous action. One of the examples of that is lasers. There's an interesting article that came out talking about how lasers can be used against drones, and very cheaply, as opposed to what we're doing today, which is like sending like $1 million missiles to blow up these drones. So then you have this competition between AIs for control of a battlefield. So that's a bit of an arms race. And I think that will probably drive, my guess would be that would drive a lot of innovation in AI. So maybe that's one kind of take on the international implications. I don't know if you have any other areas of implications on the international scene.
No, that's a really good answer. And how it's so you mentioned the warfare part and the arms race. That's like how the Manhattan Project happened, but also how you related with printing press. That AI is more like that. I haven't really seen that analogy commonly made, but that seems like a really great analogy. That it's not like a bomb, you know?
Right, right. And I always I kind of I laugh at the picture of AI as this huge threat that has massive harms associated with it, especially comparing it to, nuclear holocaust, when we could demonstrate huge harms, like, exploding a nuclear or an atomic warhead or a nuclear warhead. Yeah, that has massive, verifiable, visible harms that can be empirically demonstrated. And so, sure, that's probably a good reason to think, yeah, it's pretty dangerous. With AI, it's like, well, where's the beef? I haven't seen anybody explode. I haven't seen any of these massive harms, and yet they're kind of put on the same scale. It's mind blowing to me.
Yeah. Moving on, I'd love to know what's your reason for being in the artificial intelligence space.
Well, I mean, for me, it's just pure interest. I just found it wildly interesting. When I began to play with the technology 2.5 years ago, or roughly something like that, when GPT-3 came out, um, I could see that it was part of what's interesting to me about the technology is it parallels, not even parallels, it kind of mimics the structure of the human brain. So the entire neural architecture that underlies large language models and transformers, other ML models, all of that was at one time a kind of like redhead stepchild idea of the AI community. At one time, the symbolic AI folks, the kind of Chomskyite crew who thought that we could um, systematically and deterministically describe language, and once we could do that, we could have a kind of the kind of LLM systems that we have today. We could get that behavior by systematically going through and understanding language. That was the going view. And there was this kind of rogue, underdog group of researchers who thought, not sure if that's going to work out. What if we try to do what the human brain does? And they were pilloried. They were, people thought that was crazy, and eventually, they won the day in an incredible upset. So there's this story with it that's so interesting. I think it's also interesting because it teaches us about ourselves. You know, by seeing how large language models work, we can understand more about how our own brains work. Um, you see features of these systems like hallucinations, which you can find echoes of that in the human experience as well. You see features like the manipulability of these systems, or indeed the bias of these systems, and you see that echoes of that in the human experience as well. Um, so that's interesting. It teaches us about that. But there's also just this very interesting project, and I think it's part of the kind of the ethos or the aesthetic even of being an engineer, which is that I want to automate everything. I don't know why. There's just this drive that I have that's like, what if we could automate all of it? I don't know. It would be very interesting. And so, what if we could automate a human? That's very interesting to me. Can we reproduce a human in code, maybe in a virtual environment or something? There's just something kind of irreducibly interesting about that to me. Um, and so that's why I got interested in the field, and I'm so fortunate that AI has come along and given me the opportunity to be involved in something day to day that I'm genuinely interested in intellectually. That took a long time for me to figure out something that kind of merge the intellectual interest with what I'm actually doing on a day-to-day basis. It was a long time in my life where that was not the case. And so I'm just very lucky. Incredibly grateful.
So you found the sweet spot. That's very exciting. Because whenever I
Yeah.
hear these entrepreneurs, it's like when they find it, that's when a lot of things change.
Yeah. It's so important if you can. I mean, there's plenty of stories of entrepreneurs who are successful doing something that they're not that incredibly passionate about. But man, it's so great if you are. I'm again, I'm lucky and grateful to have found something where I can really bed down in, and look, talk to me in 10 years. We'll see if my interests change. But so far, it's been great.
Yeah. And then especially with the everyday news, it's kind of like I'm always on the hooks and always just aware because it's so exciting of like Figure or Devon coming out. And I want to ask, how do you stay updated in all the news in AI without being overwhelmed? And where are the sources you get information from?
Well, I don't bother with trying to not be overwhelmed. I'm completely overwhelmed all the time with all of the AI news, but that's okay. Um, I'm on Twitter, but I find YouTube to be a great resource. I like listening to kind of in-depth stuff about papers, um, but also just kind of ongoing news. YouTube is really great for that. Um, and then reading the occasional paper as it comes out. I do that, and that's really how I stay updated. um, I'm sure uh, you know everybody's got to have their own style, their own filter, their own medium. I think the important thing is find find people who are really making waves and try and deeply understand um, what they're doing, and that will give you a sense of where the field is headed. And then you can begin to start to skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. and and ultimately, I mean, that's kind of what's behind my little investment thesis around AI assistance. We'll see if I'm right. I don't know for sure. Um, but um, but that's I think that's the important thing is understand the field deeply enough and kind of the trajectories and the velocities of it so that you can begin to make some predictions about where it might be headed because it is moving so fast. It is um, incredibly difficult um, to to. I don't think it's that hard to stay abreast of kind of the developments, but again, it is difficult. The real alpha is in making predictions about where it's going and then building for that.
And talking about AI, how do you incorporate AI into your own personal life for productivity?
Yeah. Well, for about maybe 6 or 7 years of my career, I didn't code. I started as a coder, and then I kind of went into the dark side of project management and product management and stuff like that. And I set coding down and didn't write a line of code. And then when about 2.5 years ago, when AI started to get more popular, it got me back into coding because I found it really easy to learn a new language in. So I taught myself Node using AI, and to this day, I use AI intensely in my software development. I still do a fair amount of software development. Um, and what I end up doing is, it's not just the kind of GitHub Copilot where occasionally it makes an autocomplete for me. I really go to it as a resource on almost every feature that I develop. Every feature, I hand it the whole code base of the file that I'm about to make changes in, and I say, okay, this is the feature I want to build. Take a crack, and it's phenomenal. I mean, it's wildly more productive than anything I could do on my own unassisted. I mean, I think the studies say you move like 1.3x, maybe something like that. It feels to me more than that. It feels like two, maybe three, 4x sometimes. Um, and so yeah, so I use it intensely for software development. Claude 3 is the best model right now, in my opinion, for that sort of thing. And so, um, big user of Claude. Um, and of course, for kind of intellectual exploration, I find it to be an incredible conversation partner, an incredible teacher. It's like having access to a brilliant mind, or at least a very knowledgeable mind, on demand. And so, any random idea that I have, or any question that I have, I typically go to AI to engage with it, and it's been it's been incredible. I mean, what an amazing gift to the world to be able to do that. That's just, yeah. I mean, you used to have to go to a college or a university and talk to a lecturer or something like that if you wanted to have a conversation about with a full being able to ask a question in context and get an expert reply. Like, that was incredibly difficult to do, or search a bunch of stuff on Google and hunt through a bunch of ads and not know the kind of the provenance of the information. So yeah, I use AI, I would say, really fundamentally.
On using AI, I just found it funny because you had a Twitter post where you said you were on the car and you were just talking with ChatGPT for 45 minutes. And I actually did
Yes.
that myself, and I found it
Yeah.
quite amusing because the latency is not that much. It felt like a human, and
Yeah.
the accent wasn't terrible. And I was like,
Right.
man, this is like my therapist. Like, it actually answers my
Yeah.
question. So
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah. No, it's and something about that voice modality is, um really, it feels different than typing. It feels more fluid. I chat ChatGPT has a little bit of an issue. I wish you could kind of interrupt easier, and the latency was lower and stuff. Like there's kinks to be ironed out with that. But yeah, oh, absolutely, it's incredible for that, and so many applications. Therapy, yeah, I haven't used it much for for therapy, but that's a huge area. Another whole kind of realm that has an underserved population that could be hugely helped.
Um, Last question. I'm not sure if you saw on Twitter. I'm 17 at the moment, and
Yeah,
yeah, and I'd love to ask the question: if you could travel back to when you specifically were 17 years old, what would you tell from your current experience?
that's a good question. 17. What was I doing when I was 17? Oh man, I was a pimply faced teenager. um, what would I say to myself? I've, I mean, it's so fundamental, but it was just something along the lines of it's gonna be okay. It's gonna work out. I think when I was 17, um, I was not socially very adept. I certainly wasn't popular. Wasn't the smartest kid. I was reasonably bright, but I wasn't the top. Um, and I really didn't know how I would fit in, how I would make it, if I would make it. I didn't have a girlfriend until I was in college, you know? So, like, for me at that time, I think it was just very unsure. Um, and I think the thing I would say to myself is, it's okay. Trust the process. You will get there. Um, Learn to be happy with where you are. Life has so many ups, so many downs. It's constantly changing. Um, it's the one of the keys anyway is to learn to be happy in whatever circumstances, um, and to trust that it will all work out. Um, I think that's what I would say to myself.
Well, that's a beautiful way to end the podcast. It was my pleasure hosting you, Andy Walters, and yeah, thanks for your time.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, thanks for yours.